So, if there's one thing that really sucks about the era I'm born in, it's that I'm just right after all of the great artists I really like have stopped at least playing live or have all become cadavers. However, as with all things in life, there is a caveat. I am born in the era of accessibility. Any song or album I wanted to hear is just right there. And that goes for a lot of things in life, including one of my other favorite interests, video games. However, even with all the accessibility that the internet presents to me, there are still, as with all things in life, once more I reiterate, caveats, and these caveats come in the form of songs that slip through my fingers into the wayside of history, where almost nobody knows about them. Take, for example, the song that's playing right now. It's known to the internet as the most mysterious song on the internet. Nobody knows when it was made, or who made it, and people have been searching for a great many years, and it's honestly a really interesting little piece of internet history. Or the song I'm about to show you right now, which is the first ever recording of the Smiths that up until a month ago had been completely lost and we might not have ever seen. So, naturally, this concept of things that are lost and forgotten also translates quite well to video games. One might think of games that existed during the infancy stages of video games and sort of failed to find their footing, if you will, in that sort of Wild West era of video games where everybody was trying to make a hit mascot and only a few of them managed to stick. But what I'm thinking of is a bit more contemporary. I'm thinking of games that, heck, even a few years ago, you probably still could have played, but have now, because of one circumstance or another, have been rendered inaccessible to the common consumer, and as a result are often forgotten or just not thought of anymore. Today we're going to be examining a few different examples of the concept that I just started talking about, and we're going to talk about why these games are no longer purchasable by any conventional means and what this can mean for the gaming industry. So without further ado, enjoy. The first game we're going to talk about is a true Capcom classic. A lot of old school gamers might remember this. That's right, it's... That's right, I'm going to be talking about Ducktales Remastered. So yeah, Ducktales Remastered of all things. Those of you who like that really vintage era of Capcom games would absolutely love this game. You know, people who like Captain Commando, or Bionic Commando, or, you know, Mega Man, of course. Mega Man would be probably the most similar. But that era of Capcom games, you would absolutely love DuckTales Remastered. And I say that because DuckTales Remastered is technically a Capcom game from that era. And that's because DuckTales, at least the original one, not the remastered one, though they are largely the same, was strong-armed by one of Capcom's greatest talents, Takuro Fujiwara. Fujiwara, if you don't know who he is, directed Ghosts and Goblins, Commando, Bionic Commando, was the main producer for Mega Man, and also did some work on Strider, so in a lot of ways he really embodied that classic vintage era of Capcom games, and some would consider that to be Capcom's golden era. So when we look at DuckTales, DuckTales' design is largely similar to those games. It's this tough-as-nails, really fun, you know, classic game. And it's a real shame that all of those games are very easily playable nowadays. However, DuckTales, not so much. So, DuckTales at its core is a very old-style platformer in the sense that it's as hard and as cheap as diamonds. But that isn't to say that DuckTales is unfair, just that it's very challenging. But sort of like Mega Man, that in the sense that initially, yes, it's very hard, but once you understand the game, and especially on subsequent playthroughs, once you get better and better at it, it becomes this very rewarding experience, right? And, offers that same sort of replayability that at least I get out of Mega Man games, where I'll replay them and I sort of can see a not a literal, but sort of mental timeline of how my skill has gotten better, and ultimately that's really fun, and I kind of like that. And of course, DuckTales possesses a trait often characterized in every single old platformer that we often fondly remember, and that is a really fun and memorable soundtrack, and boy does DuckTales deliver. DuckTales' soundtrack is superb. I mean, the main theme of the game is a remix of the show from the television. I've been actually playing it in the background right now, so if you watch DuckTales as a kid, it should be instantly recognizable. But what I really like about the soundtrack is how DuckTales Remastered doesn't necessarily get rid of that old classic video game feel, despite the fact that they redo the whole soundtrack, right? They could have easily ruined it by over-contemporizing it, but they sort of upgrade it while at the same time, understanding what this game is to the people who like it, which is this cult classic for old-school Capcom fans. And speaking about art, the game's art direction is wonderful. I really love it. And it's not that it's super creative, it's just that they simply did a direct upgrade. The game has cutscenes now, 3D models, but every character sprite is now a 2D sprite that's meant to mimic, almost exactly how they looked like in the show. So, as far as I'm concerned, it's a direct upgrade. A lot of remasters tend to sort of lose what people liked about the original one, but this game really, really does a good job of keeping what is there that everybody liked while also implementing, add-ons to it, which I'm a big fan of. So you can imagine how, shocked I was when that game was being taken off of pretty much every digital retailer it was listed on, and, I mean, considering the fact that the game was digital only, was mildly concerning. So I had to pick it up last August, right before it went down forever. So the only way you can get it now or acquire it would be through emulation. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't emulate things, but I'm just not going to state my opinion on that, right? So you do as you will. But it is a shame that this game's no longer accessible. Later in the video, I will be discussing exactly why, because I'd like to be the binding thesis of the video. But yes, moving on to the next game. Scott Pilgrim is a massive part of my childhood. It's this amazing pseudo-manga made by a Canadian guy, and it's also a great cult classic movie starring Michael Cera. At a glance, Scott Pilgrim seems like a boy meets girl love story, but it's also a story about personal growth interspersed with a lot of fight scenes and video game references, making it really, really unique when it comes to love stories. To summarize the story, Scott Pilgrim wants to date Ramona Flowers, but he has to defeat her 7 evil ex-boyfriends to do so. I'm hoping that sold you on it. I'm not going to disclose it anymore because I really, really think you should experience it for yourself. The book and, of course, the movie separately. They're both great and also different experiences. So, naturally, this manga-inspired video game referencing love story would do well to be translated to a video game. And most of the time, licensed things really, really suck. But this is, if there was ever an exception that proves the rule, this game is so good. It's one of the most video gamey games I've ever played in my entire life. And the fact that you can't buy it anymore should be considered high treason. The game isn't perfect. As an adaptation, it doesn't do especially well. It does do well in some areas, like for example, it fuses the character designs from the book and the movies, so no matter which one you're a bigger fan of, you should like the game. So for example, in the book, Gideon Graves has spiky hair. In the movie, he has a sort of bowl haircut because of the actor, right? So what they ended up doing in the game was they took sort of the style of the comic, but they also gave him the bowl haircut, so it's kind of like this marriage of the two designs, and that's really, really unique for a technically movie adaptation game. The gameplay itself is really fun. It borrows from that old school arcade style of beat 'em up like the TMNT game, the Simpsons beat 'em up that was 4 players, that one. It borrows from Bionic Commando, and of course it takes the heaviest inspiration from Final Fight, definitely. So if you like those types of games, this should fall right into the fold. The game itself, just like the movie and the comics, makes lots of video game references. It really, really loves the fact that it's a video game and was clearly made by people who love video games.
Is that a gram? New card. What do you think?
I mean, I said they love them, not necessarily that they're good at making them. The game features one of the most fundamentally important mainstays of the classic beat-em-up genre, and that is 4-player co-op, featuring tons of different Scott Pilgrim characters, which, I mean, the characters of Scott Pilgrim are, in my opinion, its strongest asset. So being able to kick ass as Ramona Flowers, Scott Pilgrim, and Wallace Wells is admittedly really fun. Every character, for the most part, with some exceptions, has their own skills and abilities as you level up throughout the game, which is really fun and adds a certain level of replayability. Additionally, every single character has their own personalized ending, and most of them are references to classic video games. But perhaps my favorite thing about the game is the wonderful soundtrack done by the band Anamanaguchi. It is uncontested my favorite soundtrack in any video game. It fits so well with what was trying to be accomplished at the time, and it got me into Anamanaguchi, and I still listen to them to this day. If you haven't listened to Anamanaguchi, please go listen to the soundtrack of this game, or better yet, check out their USA album that came out recently. It's a really, really good album. They are so good at what they do, and honestly the game wouldn't be the same without them. But just like everything that's released digital exclusive when it comes to video games, its days are numbered. But there's a reason I can still buy Super Meat Boy, but I can't buy Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, anymore. And I'll be discussing that in the second part of the video, since this video is getting a bit long. In the next part, I'm going to be going through one last game, maybe 2 depending on how I feel, and then I'm going to bring every game together and disclose why they don't exist anymore, why you can't buy them, and talk about why that's a bad thing and what we can do to prevent it, etc., etc., etc. So, stay tuned for that, subscribe, I suppose that would probably let you see the next part better than somebody who isn't subscribed. But I digress, have a good one, thank you very much for watching.
We are the pretty, petty